This is the Thursday, March 14th, 2013 meeting of the Zoning Board of Examiners and Appeals this evening. Before we start on our agenda and the roll call, there's one item on the agenda, item C2, Annual Election of Officers. I would entertain a motion from a board member to move that to the end of our meeting. Our elections are so contentious normally. It's probably going to be a long, drawn-out battle, so the public doesn't have to watch that bloodbath. But maybe before we do that, we could have the roll call, please.
Timothy Vig.
Here.
Dean Karst.
Here.
Jeff Ron.
Here.
Bill Patrick. John Dunham.
Here.
Deanna Vlad. Here. Stephanie Eicher. Jason Hart.
Here.
Lisa Dole.
Here. Sorry.
Thank you. We have two new board members with us this evening, Mr. Hart and Ms. Dole. Thank you both for being here this evening and being part of the board. Let's see. Is there any, perhaps I could ask, is there any objection from any of the board members to us revising the agenda to move the election of officers to the end? Is there any opposition? Seeing none, we'll move item C2 to the end of the meeting. Minutes. We do not have any minutes before us this evening. Disclosures. C1. Are there any disclosures from any of the board? And I believe our two new board members, we have a resolution that's on the consent agenda that, since you weren't at those meetings, you'll need to be recusing yourself from the approval of the consent agenda items.
Do we need to speak to recuse ourselves?
I'm sorry, Ms.
Do we need to speak up to recuse ourselves or make a motion to or anything?
No, just for the record.
Oh, okay.
You haven't listened to the case files for those cases that we're hearing the resolutions, I'm assuming?
Right, correct.
Okay.
Yeah.
Mr. Hart, yourself as well, you have not listened to the case files for those?
No, sir.
Okay. So the record can, yes, Mr. Dunham.
Mr. Chairman, I was not at January's meeting, so I'll be abstaining from that vote as well.
Thank you, Mr. Dunham. Well, with that in mind, that puts us at four members that were present. So I believe we won't have a majority of the fully constituted board to vote on those resolutions. So I believe we will have to postpone action on those consent agenda items then. Sure. Mr. Vig, do you concur with that as a parliamentarian?
I do, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Mr. Ron, do you have comments?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I believe in the past some of these have been time-sensitive issues. Should we check with staff perhaps first to see whether or not the petitioners have requested quick action, just to determine whether or not we would need a special board meeting later this month?
Sure. I guess I don't think if they are time sensitive, I don't think we can hear them tonight, but we'll have to check on that. Ms. Ferguson?
Mr. Chair, Mr. Ron, whether or not they're time sensitive, I really don't know. As far as I know, it's just a resolution. I wouldn't think that they would be.
Well, maybe for the record, if it is an issue, and we aren't scheduled to have a meeting next month for any active cases. We may want to reflect or keep that in mind for these resolutions for next month. Okay. Is there any other discussion on the action on the consent agenda? Those items are moved to the next zoning board meeting. Are there any other disclosures this evening? Seeing none, that will move us on to our to our first case. We have no appearance requests, unfinished business, or regular agenda. So, before we start our hearing on our first case this evening, I'd like to read the order of business for the for variances. The chair shall introduce the variance and explain the procedure to be followed. The variance case number and the name of the applicant shall be read into the record. The board shall hear and rule on any objections to the sufficiency of notice. The board shall hear a brief staff presentation outlining the variance, not to exceed 10 minutes. On conclusion of the staff presentation, the board members and the applicant may then direct questions to the staff through the chair. The applicant shall give his or her presentation, not exceeding 10 minutes. Throughout the proceedings, the burden of proof rests upon the applicant, who must convince the board by a preponderance of the evidence that the variance should be granted. On conclusion of the applicant's presentation, the board members and the staff may then direct questions to the applicant through the chair. The hearing shall then be open for public testimony. Each person has 3 minutes. Representatives of groups have 5 minutes. All persons who testify may be questioned by the board, staff, or the applicant. On conclusion of the public testimony, the staff, followed by the applicant, shall have the right of rebuttal. The board shall proceed to develop oral findings and conclusions with regard to the variance and disposition of the variance. The staff shall reduce the oral findings and conclusions to writing for subsequent adoption by the board at a later meeting. The matter then rests with the board, and the chair asks for a positive motion from the board. Our first case this evening is case 2003-024. The petitioner petitioners are William and Sharon Keller. They have indicated they're here this evening. Could staff provide us with the sufficiency of notice, please?
Yes, 60 public hearing notices were mailed out, and we did not receive any in return.
Thank you, Ms. Ferguson. Could you proceed with the staff presentation, please?
Yes, I should first say that Margaret O'Brien, this was her case. She was unable to attend tonight, so I have come in her stead. The petition site is developed with a single-family dwelling that was constructed in 1993. An addition was constructed at the northeast corner of the structure in 1995. Apparently, an error occurred during construction of this addition that resulted in a 1-foot encroachment into the required 10-foot side yard setback along the west property boundary. The fact that the encroachment existed was not discovered until an as-built survey was prepared 12 years later. The request before the board is to allow an existing single-family structure to encroach 1 foot into the 10-foot side yard setback along the west property boundary at the greatest point of encroachment. Standard number 1, the lot is sloped 24 feet from the southeast corner to the northwest corner of the lot, and it's estimated at an average slope of 11%. The standard does not appear to be substantially met. Standard number 2, the encroachment appears to be the result of a builder error. The dwelling has existed in its current configuration for nearly 18 years without evident adverse impact on adjacent property or complaint from surrounding neighbors. The standard does not appear to be substantially met. Standard 3, the petitioner owns both lots 1 and 2. Lot 2 is an interior or middle lot. A conforming alternative would be to replat the lots to increase the size of Lot 1 by 1 foot to bring the property into conformity with the applicable zoning regulation. The petitioner is willing to replat the property to resolve the encroachment. However, the covenants for Northwood subdivision prohibit the subdivision of a lot that reduces the size of a lot, except for a subdivision that owners of 3 contiguous lots may divide the inner or middle lot, thus increasing the size of the 2 remaining lots, which shall be treated with all purposes pertinent to these covenants as enlarged single lots. This does not appear to be a reasonable conforming alternative to correct a minor encroachment that is only 1.23 square feet at the greatest point of encroachment. The standard does not appear to be substantially met. Standard 4. The encroachment is minor in nature, being only 1.23 square feet at the greatest point of encroachment. The dwelling has existed in its current configuration for nearly 18 years. Much of the natural vegetation has been retained on the petition site. The dwelling is not visible to the properties to the south. Granting the variance will not adversely affect the surrounding properties. Development on the petition site is generally in keeping with development on the surrounding properties. This standard appears to be substantially met. Standard 5, if granted, the variance will not violate the intent of the code or change the character of the zoning district. This standard appears to be substantially met. Standard 6, the variance, if approved, will not adversely affect the health, safety, and welfare of the people of Anchorage. The variance is minor in nature and is not readily apparent. This standard appears to be substantially met. Standard 7, the variance, the encroachment is not discernible and is the minimum required to allow the existing building to remain without undertaking extensive alteration that could impair the structural integrity of the dwelling. This standard appears to be substantially met. The department recommends denial as standards 1, 2, and 3 do not appear to be substantially met. If, however, at the conclusion of the public hearing, the board finds that all 7 standards have been substantially met, the following 2 conditions are offered for the board's consideration, and those 2 conditions are on page 9.
Thank you, Ms. Ferguson. Are there any questions of the staff by the board? Seeing none, could we have the petitioner come forward, please?
Good evening.
Good evening. Could you state and spell your name for the record, please?
My name is William Keller. Last name is Keller.
Thank you, Mr. Keller. And you have 10 minutes for your presentation. And again, we must find that all 7 standards are met. So if your presentation could at least address the 7 standards.
Yes, sir. I understand where you're going with this. I met with Margaret O'Brien more than once to try and regard the first 3 issues. And basically, the way I see it is standard 1 addresses something you might find when you're trying to place your house on the property prior to the start of the excavation. We originally built the house in such a way as to give us a longer driveway that was less steep, et cetera, and it's all stated in here, but we twisted the house just a hair also to increase the view. Now, when we built the addition on, because it's kind of a skewed in the lot, there was a contractor error. I think he went to the wrong stake, either at the back of the property or at the front of the property, one or the other, but he assured me that he was within the past the 10-foot area. And I had to take him on his word for that because everything he said looked good at the time. So that's about the number 1. It's not self-imposed because I did not do the building, nor did I lay out the lines, etc. So I cannot answer that truthfully that I had any involvement with that whatsoever, but it was my contractor. was the other one? And granted, too, physical circumstances, here we go again with the lot and everything else and the way it's set. This is something that came up after the fact. If I had known we had this problem ahead of time before when we were in the process of construction, we would have remedied the situation for the 10-foot setback. But in the meantime, I do have, and this is new to be presented to the people of the board, as I canvassed our neighborhood for any objections to the variance.
And you can bring that forward. We will have to, we'll have to keep one original and log it into the file for 30 days. Okay. Okay. And I'll have you speak into the microphone after. We'll take these copies then.
Okay, now I have distributed the copies and the original of the interviews I had with all my neighbors with the exception of one. And if you go to the third to the last page, there's one gentleman here that no matter how many times I tried, I could not get a hold of him. If you go to the second to the last page, you'll see addresses in the lots going around there. Those are the lots that I approached, and you have their agreement that the variance is fine with them on the preceding pages. That's 10 of the 11 people. Now, if you take a look at the very last page, we went down to the state recorder's office, Anchorage Recording District, and is in process now of being recorded a stipulation that if any time anything is ever built on Lot 2, it shall remain 20 feet away from the structure on Lot 1. Being as that lot is 205 feet wide along the road line, it should not affect the placement of a house on that property at all. But that's the only way we could see to mitigate the circumstances we have that we were dealt here. That, unless you have any questions, that's about all I have for my statements. We've tried everything possible in the world to straighten this thing out. So.
Thank you, Mr. Keller. Are there any questions of the petitioner by board members? Mr. Ron.
Thank you, through the chair. Mr. Keller, I do have a question about the parking aprons shown on the as-built. Does that carry through onto Lot 2 and to the street, or does it end at the property line for Lot 1?
It does at this time, but as soon as the weather breaks, I am cutting that part of the asphalt off at the property line.
Thank you.
I've already got it marked. The surveyor helped me stake out so I could get a straight line right at the lot line, cut it, break it out.
Thank you. Mr. Dunham.
Yes. Mr. Keller, the staff's report indicated that you'd be willing to replat the property, but there's a protective covenant that prohibits replatting.
Yes, sir.
Or, I guess, eliminating the lot line. That would be the easiest solution. Have you looked at adjusting the lot line?
Because of CC&Rs, no, sir, I haven't, because of the fact they say that would be a replat as far as I know.
Okay. Because sometimes you can shift the lot line, still maintain approximately the same square footage on both lots. It wouldn't be a straight north-south line or an east-west line like you would have currently, but it would be an adjusted line.
You're talking about for that little dog leg on a triangle?
Yeah, just angle it so that you maintain it.
I personally would not have any problems with that at all either, but then, by the written word here of the covenants, basically that's kind of a subdivision of another lot, so the way I look at it.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Are there any other questions of the applicant? Mr. Ron.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Keller, can you speak more to the slope of your property and how it affected the placement of your house?
How it affected what, sir?
The placement of your house, the slope, and how you ran with the contours as opposed to perpendicular to them?
That actually seemed to be a luck of the draw. My wife and I were looking at the lot before it was developed, when we were thinking about placing a house on there. And by twisting the house just a hair, we got a lot better view, and it actually ended up following the contours a lot greater than if we'd been square with the street. And by that, we've got a good range all the way from Bear Mountain right to the side, all the way through Palmer. You can see up to the valley by Glen Allen and down to the inlet. In the wintertime, you can see the lights on the oil wells out there, or gas wells.
Thank you, Mr. Ron. Mr. Vig?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Excuse me. Mr. Keller, if it were possible to rotate the lot line such that it provided the clearance and did not decrease the area of either Lot 1 or Lot 2, would that be an acceptable solution to you?
I don't see how we can move the lot line without affecting the square footage of one or the other, though, sir. I mean, if I have to do a little triangle dog leg, I can do that easily.
Well, what I think Mr. Dunham was envisioning and what I was thinking of was if you were to rotate the lot line in a northwesterly or consider it a clockwise direction about the midpoint of the lot line,
Right.
about 3 feet on the north lot line to the west and about 3 feet on the south lot line to the east, the amount that you would take away from Lot 1 would be offset by the amount that you'd be gaining from Lot 2, and the area wouldn't change, but you could get the clearance, I believe. I hesitate to be an armchair surveyor here at the board meeting, but I think there's a solution there that could be solved through a platting mechanism instead of a variance.
I have no problems trying to do whatever needs to get done, but I was worried about the CC&Rs because the way they're stated in here, I would be increasing one and shrinking another one that's on a lot between two occupants, so, which is prohibited by the CC&Rs. I have no problems with it. If you say it's good to go, we'll do it.
Thank you.
Mr. Dunham?
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, I think what Mr. Vig's trying to suggest to you is an alternative, although I don't know that maybe our chairman could, or Mr. Ron could verify that, but we're not licensed to tell you that it's good to go.
Right.
So, but that's an alternative, I think, that would meet the intent of the CC&Rs and still, you'd maintain the same lot size on both lots. And just for your information, the CC&Rs are enforceable through your homeowners association, and if they decide not to enforce it, that's one way of looking at it. You can still comply with the municipal code and I guess work things out with your neighbors so that they understand what you're doing.
Well, they pretty much understand what we're trying to do at this time, yes.
Okay. But we're not going to be able to tell you that you're good to go with a lot adjustment because I'm not a licensed land surveyor. I don't think Mr. Vig is either. So.
Yeah.
Thank you, Mr. Dunham. Mr. Keller, on page 3 of our packet, actually page 2 or 3 of our packet is the as-built, and page 3 shows the 10-foot setback line.
Yes, sir.
With the orientation of the house on the lot, where staff has indicated in there right up that we're talking about an encroachment of about 14.4 square inches.
Actually, turns at the point, if you take a look, I've got a bigger detail on page 21.
Okay.
That's our actual measurements from the center line of the lot line.
Okay.
And it's ascertained by dropping a plumb bob down from the second floor for that 9 foot 5/8. And there was no wind blowing that day.
Thank you. It seems like it's a relatively small area
Yes.
that we're talking about just for this portion
Yes, sir.
of the house that encroaches.
And it is 8 foot 2.5 above the grade right there at that point. It's an overhang on the front of the house.
Thank you.
Yes, sir.
Are there any other questions of the applicant by the board? Seeing no questions, we will open the hearing up for public testimony. You can probably just step aside if you'd like.
Sure, no problem.
Is there anyone from the public wishing to testify? Anyone at all? I suppose I should have asked, Ms. Ferguson, did you have any question of the applicant?
No, I don't, Mr.
Okay,
Chair.
thank you. Seeing no one from the public coming forward, the public hearing is closed. Does staff have any rebuttal?
No, I don't.
Thank you. Mr. Keller, do you have anything further for rebuttal? There was no public hearing, so.
No, sir, I'm on the mercy here. I'm just trying to make things right. That's all.
Okay. Well, thank you, Mr. Keller. With that, the matter rests with the board. You can have a seat if you'd like.
All right.
Matter rests with the board. Could I have a positive motion from a board member, please? Mr. Dunham.
Mr. Chairman, in the case of 2013-024, I move that a variance be granted from AMC 2140-070G to allow an existing structure to encroach into the 10-foot side yard setback in the R7 Intermediate Rural Residential District. And with the conditions suggested by staff on page 9.
The two conditions?
2 conditions,
Thank-
yes.
Thank you, Mr. Dunham. Could I have a second to the motion, please? Mr. Ron, you've indicated you would second that motion?
That's correct, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Ron. Mr. Dunham, could you speak to your motion, please?
Okay, Mr. Chairman, I want to say first off, I think this is a de minimis variance. This is really small. You know, when you have to measure in inches the amount of the encroachment into a 10-foot side yard setback, I think this is a really small encroachment. And it looks like it was an honest mistake by the petitioner. So I'm going to go ahead and try to answer the 3 conditions or circumstances that staff did not find were met and answer those, but I'd also be interested in hearing from other board members as well. Regarding condition number 1, there exist exceptional or extraordinary physical circumstances of the subject property, such as, but not limited to, stream, wetlands, or slope, and such physical circumstances are not applicable to other land in the same district. I find that condition is partially met, and I believe the reason of that is according to the testimony from the petitioner, slope was a factor in how he sited the house. Although, you know, again, I will say that this is such a de minimis variance that I think that his ability to be able to determine that there was an 11-inch and some odd fraction encroachment here was really hard to tell based on what he had out there. So I think that standard's met. And standard 2, because of these physical circumstances, strict application of this code would create an exceptional or undue hardship upon the owner and would deprive him of rights commonly enjoyed by other properties in the same district under the terms of this ordinance. Because this is so small, really nothing is going to be resolved with this petitioner by having him either remove that corner or go through another public process to resolve it like a replat. So I believe that that would create an exceptional hardship for the petitioner. There was an honest mistake made here, and I believe that, part of what we have to measure as a board is, does the punishment fit the crime? And I'm not saying there was a crime here. I'm just saying it was an honest mistake. And I don't think subjecting the petitioner to 2 public hearings to resolve one problem that's less than 12 inches into a setback is reasonable. The hardship is not self-imposed, and special conditions and circumstances do not result from the actions of the applicant, and such conditions and circumstances do not merely constitute an inconvenience. The petitioner testified this evening that he actually had a contractor doing this, and again, this is a very small encroachment. Picking it up by eyesight, which I'm assuming the petitioner is not a licensed professional land surveyor, he wouldn't know that it was that close. So while he may have been in charge of the contractor, I don't believe that his actions resulted in this encroachment. And I agree with staff that the rest of the conditions have been met, and concur with those findings.
Thank you, Mr. Dunham. Mr. Ron?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I do agree with Mr. Dunham's interpretation of standards 1 and through 3. I'll speak just briefly to standard 1 and reiterate the slope effectiveness of the lot. It appears that the petitioner has been pushed towards us both by that physical circumstance and also the double frontage, which wasn't discussed to much great detail, as well as the CCNRs. Those 3 things, I think, have resulted in the petitioner being here today. And I do applaud the petitioner for his presentation and awareness of those 3 standards of concern. Regarding standard 3, I agree that the hardship is not self-imposed, but for the record, I don't want to tie my decision there to the contractor's actions. I can't excuse the contractor for their actions and do not decide on this standard in that way, but rather tie that hardship to the slope, the double frontage, and the CCNRs as well. I also incorporate by reference standards 4 or staff's findings on standards 4 through 7, and I intend to support the motion. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Ron. Are there any other comments by any of the board members? Any of the other board members? Mr. Vig?
Thank you. After reading the applicant's package, I had convinced myself that there was a platting solution here that could eliminate the need for a variance. And having listened to the applicant and Mr. Dunham and Mr. Ron, I think presented compelling information about the fact that this is a very minor encroachment and subjecting the applicant to another series of public meetings to eliminate that or adjust for that, I think, is probably excessive. So initially I was leaning against supporting the motion, and having listened to the testimony of the applicant and other board members, I'm leaning towards support. But I appreciated the discussion.
Thank you, Mr. Vig. Are there any other comments? I also intend to support the motion, concur with Mr. Dunham's comment, feeling that this is a de de minimis variance. It is extremely small. Concur with his findings as well as Mr. Ron's. Two other points. The petitioner, I applaud him. He could have gone the route of a plat. It wasn't for lack of not wanting to follow a procedure. He could, he's obviously paid a fee to be here this evening for a variance that could have been towards a short plat. But so the petitioner is definitely trying to resolve this. Appreciate that. Secondly, the document that he presented us this evening from Lot 2, which would be the most impacted lot by this variance, is the lot that has, by this document, is stated that there would be the setback. Even if that wasn't the case, he is the owner of Lot 2, and so that's more of a reason that Standard 4 is met, which staff has already agreed to. But I do find that that weighs towards my support of the variance. So again, I will intend to support the motion based on the findings as presented by Mr. Dunham and Ron. Are there any other comments by any of the board members? If not, please vote. That didn't show up on the display. What was the vote? That motion passed to kill the suspense, but that motion passes by a vote. That motion passes by a vote of 7-0. As I mentioned earlier, in order for a variance to pass, it must receive 5 out of 9, which is the fully constituted board. So it must achieve 5 positive votes. The vote on that was 7-0, so that motion does pass. Mr. Hart?
Mr. Chairman, I actually voted no, but for some reason it came up as yes.
Okay. For the record, the vote was 6-1 then. Mr. Hart was a no. We'll get that corrected. 6-1, that motion does still pass. I must also say every final decision of the board shall clearly state on its face it is a final decision with respect to all issues involved in the case, and that the parties have 30 days from the date of mailing or other distribution of the decision to file an appeal to the Superior Court. Good on that. That is our last public hearing of the evening. With that brings us back to our annual election of officers.
Thank you, everybody, for your assistance.
Thank you.
I appreciate it.
So we have a couple options that I see. One is 2 of our board members aren't here tonight, so we could elect them as chair and vice chair and make it unanimous. Or another option would be for someone that is interested in stepping up. Mr. Dunham, you're currently the vice chair. Would be interested in serving as chair. Does anyone else want to make a speech nominating themselves or someone else? I do think it's healthy as a board. Mr. Ron has served as chair recently. It's healthy to have some movement among the chair, vice chair, parliamentarian. So I'm open to any suggestions or election of officers, nominations, I should say. Mr. Ron?
Are we starting with nominations for chair then, Mr. Chair? Replacing you first?
Yes.
Okay. Well, Mr. Dunham, if you would entertain a nomination, I would be happy to provide one.
I would do it if the board would be a little understanding. There's probably going to be 1 or 2 meetings I won't be able to make. I've recently taken on some new assignments with my employer, and I'll be sitting in Barrow for about 25% of my time this year. So.
I think that was a yes, Mr. Ron.
All right. I nominate Mr. Dunham for chairman of the board.
I'm willing to second that. I don't know if I can or not, but I'll second that. Ms. Watt.
Sorry, I was going to say I would second that.
Thank you very much. We have a motion and a second for Mr. Dunham to be the chair. Is there anyone else want to keep nominations open? Anyone else interested in seeing no one? Is there any opposition to, I guess we got to make it positive. Does everyone, we want to vote for Mr. Dunham as chair? All in favor? Aye. I think it's
Aye.
Okay, well, it's a work in progress.
So where's the smoke, Mr. Chair?
What's that?
Where's the smoke?
Yeah, it's white.
I think we can take a voice vote on it.
Yeah. Is there any opposition to Mr. Dunham being chair? Seeing no one, Mr. Dunham will serve as chair. Vice chair. Mr. Dunham is currently the vice chair, so.
Mr. Chairman, I'd like to nominate Mr. Vig for the vice chair position, since he's in the queue already. So.
I was trying to figure out how to gracefully
Here's your
down a little bit.
opportunity to decline.
Well, you know, I've served in an officer's role for, I don't know, 3 or so years now, and I'd be content to let someone else step into the parliamentarian and or vice chair. So I too, you know, have some obligations that take me out of town from time to time, and so I'm not sure I could assure that I'd be here when you weren't, but
It sounds like Mr. Vig's not the political animal that, we
Just
expect of
needs
this
signal,
board.
yeah.
Well, let's do a numbers game, and Mr. Hart, Ms. Dell, not to put you on the spot or put any, make any sort of judgment, but seeing that you're new on the board, I'm thinking it might be best for you not to serve as in one of the positions this year anyway. So let's look around at the numbers. And I am more than happy to serve in either of the positions, but again, this board is probably the least political of any of the boards I know of. But if anyone is wanting to step up, let me know. There's some arm twisting going on the far side of the board. Mr. Vig.
I was just going to sort of, not to put Ms. Blott on the spot, but would you be, I would be willing to nominate you if you'd be willing to serve as vice chair.
I'd be willing to support if there was support from all of you to lead me down that road. That would be acceptable.
There's a lot of nods, so I think that's
I'll second that.
there's a second. Okay, thank you.
You move it on there then?
Okay. Is that what we're missing? Now, how does this Dunham? We're trying to get technology to catch up here on this part. Dunham seconded that. Are you able to? Is anybody able to push a second?
I can.
Oh, there we go. Okay. All right. There we go. Okay. All right. Is there any discussion? Was that your speech, Ms. Watt? I'm guessing that was Good. That was a good speech. All right. Please vote then. Here we go. I apologize. I think it was me on the. That motion passes. Did I'm always the slow one on the button here. Okay, and then parliamentarian. I think it's Mr. Ron, you or I then? Is that?
Perhaps, Mr. Chair, but I'd perhaps look at the parliamentarian role a little more broadly than the vice chair and chair, and think that parliamentarian may delve more into parliamentary procedure, which is something that could have been learned by either Ms. Dole or Mr. Hart outside of their very short experience on this board, and would entertain opening this parliamentarian role up to them, and of course would value Mr. Vig, our 3-year reigning parliamentarian's comments as well on the matter. So Mr. Hart or Ms. Dole, would either of you have interest in serving this board as parliamentarian?
I'm happy to spend at least a year observing everyone else and the current, whoever else might be the parliamentarian.
Well put. Mr. Hart?
I'm probably the youngest, newest person to parliamentarian rules, so I wouldn't be interested in that either.
Thank you. And I guess I didn't rule out Mr. Vig. You know, he's done such a good job continuing on in that role.
It's too bad that Mr. Patrick isn't here, because I feel like I'm depriving him of an opportunity. But
Mr. Dunham?
Mr. Chairman, there's nothing holding us back from nominating him and electing him in absentia. Or is he not on the board anymore?
No, he is on the board. He just.
Well, we could do that.
Yeah.
And just inform him at the next meeting.
So is that a motion, Mr. Dunham?
I move that I nominate Mr. Patrick for parliamentarian.
Is there a second?
I second that motion.
Okay, and Ms. Watt, everyone's weighing in for second. So, that's right. We have a motion. I believe someone gets to push the second button. All right. Thank you, Mr. Ron. Now we want to vote. Did I miss it? The please vote. I'll start voting. There we go. Ms. Dole, did you abstain? My screen shows you abstain. Was that your intention, or?
I was thinking about it. I did decide to abstain because the person was not here, and although I don't know anyone else here, I thought I
You want to get off on the right foot with him. There you go. Okay, well done. That motion passes by a vote of six to 1. Thank you. That concludes our election of officers. Regarding reports, again, I would like to welcome Mr. Hart and Ms. Dole, and I hope you learned a lot from this evening. The one case we did here, but thank you. And I would suggest sometimes a motion needs to be made just to start the dialogue. So you might find that you might not be comfortable that all 7 standards are met, but we have to start somewhere, I guess, is the point, and that's where the dialogue amongst the board can begin at some time. So you may find that as we hear future cases. Are there? I guess my other question is, next month, are there any known absences next month by any of the board members?
is the date, what, April 11th, is it? Yeah.
That would be the second.
Second Thursday?
Yeah.
She'll be here.
Okay. And it sounds like we do have some cases next month? Yes, we have some, and a couple resolutions to hear. Are there any other comments by any of the board members?
Is there an agenda or something showing the cases for the next meeting?
Not yet, no. We'll often ask the staff if the applications have been submitted, and then we typically get the cases a week or so before the next meeting.
Okay.
Mr. Ron, did you have a
I do,
comment?
just briefly, Mr. Chair. Have the new board members been told about Granicus and how to listen to old cases if in their spare time want to hear how things have gone in the past?
I don't think it was in your packet, but Jill is out of town.
Okay. Yeah, there.
Get an orientation, and they did say we could go to the website and we could listen to old,
Okay.
or previous board meetings.
And if you do happen to take up that opportunity, I suggest you listen to the two cases related to the resolutions for approval tonight. And if you do listen to those, would they then be able to vote on them if they were approved members of the board?
I believe so, because that came up, Ms. Wad, when we had a recent board member, that was a question that came up then, and I thought the answer was
Yeah,
yes.
my understanding is if they take the time to listen to the cases, then they can vote on them.
I don't know if you understood the issue on tonight, on the two resolutions tonight, was we didn't have the necessary 5 members to vote for it. So if you're absent from a board meeting, you can listen to those cases and then act on if a case were to be postponed for some reason, the public hearing closed and we act on it the next month, or hear the case, then you could vote on the resolution. Mr. Hart, did you have a question? Or I thought I saw you come up with it.
Mr. Chairman, I was just going to say that, yeah, I have listened to one previous case, and it helped to get an understanding of the process.
Okay. Are there any other comments? Mr. Dunham?
Mr. Chairman, do we have an update from staff on the new Title 21?
Yes, at this point, what we're doing is Erica McConnell is just beginning to train staff on the new Title 21. And after that, we'll open it up and start training members of the public who deal often with the boards and commissions. And I think it goes into effect in next January, and people will be able to choose either going under the current code or under the new Title 21, and they have to choose either one. We have to redo all our applications so people can check off a box which one. Once they decide they're going to be held to that, to either one of those, and then that will go on for a year, and then after that, Title 21 takes effect. I mean, it takes effect, earlier, but we're giving people a year to transition and learning the new Title 21.
Okay, thank you.
Are there any other comments from any of the board members? If not, we're adjourned.